Sarah is one of our very talented creative writing tutors, so you can take a class with her, as some of you are taking. Why is that going off? There it is, back on again. So I'd like to say thank you to these three for putting this together, and welcome you all to this evening's event. Thank you for coming. City Lit has been dedicated to adult education and lifelong learning for over 100 years, and we're pleased to team up with Robert and the people at the Browser, who are also dedicated to sharing information and contributing to the ongoing education of all of us. So quickly, some housekeeping. In the unlikely event of an alarm of any kind, out these doors, out the front doors, and across the road to the corner of Wild Street. Toilets outside around to your right, past the reception desk. You'll notice we've left some leaflets at your seats. Please, these just give you a sense of some of the wonderful courses that we teach here. I'm sorry this is flickering off and on. I think if I just wave my arms around, it's going to keep doing it. Please browse our web pages to see the full extent of what we have on offer. And now I'm going to hand over to Sarah, Henry, and Robert.
So hello, I'm just going to introduce our two speakers and talk a little bit about how the structure is going to go this evening. So Henry is a writer, currently working on a book about late bloomers, which will be out next year. Henry writes a literary blog called The Common Reader and writes online for publications like The New Statesman and The Critic. Before he was a writer, Henry worked in marketing and parliament. And Robert is founding editor of The Browser, a newsletter which tries to help you make the most out of your reading time. He reads the internet every day, but does not recommend this approach. He was previously a journalist at The Economist and is not a late bloomer, but lives in hope. So Robert and Henry are going to be discussing whether or not George Orwell's rules for writing are bad for writers. Henry is very much against Orwell's rules for writing, and Robert is a little bit more supportive of, I would say, but not necessarily in favor of. Each of these guys will have about 20 minutes to state their case, and it's kind of an argument, but also maybe just a way to maybe find some common ground or some new ground not yet tread. But we were tossing around the idea maybe after you've heard both of their arguments and had a chance to question them yourselves, we could maybe put it to a vote, an audience vote, to see if one of them has argued better than the other. But we'll see how the night goes. So yeah, about 20 minutes for each speaker and then 20 minutes to grow them. So I'm going to toss a coin to see who goes first. It's about a 50-50 chance to see if I can do this right. Would you like to call it first? Heads or tails? Okay. And I'm going to, oh, hey.
Okay.
Heads. So you're
Great.
going first. All right.
Okay.
And I think you want to.
I'm going to go up here,
Okay.
right behind us. Okay. Hello. So we have plenty of accomplished writers in this audience, and I have no business telling any of you what good writing is, and I don't have any standing against Robert, who must be one of the best read people there is, and have one of the most sort of well-informed tastes in prose. So what I'm going to do is use George Orwell's own words against him, and also the words of one or two perspicacious observers of his work. Perspicacious being a very good word that George Orwell doesn't want you to use. So, to begin with, this is a passage from Politics in the English Language, the overrated essay in which he sets out his rules, and I think people ought to pay more attention to this bit. It's the context really for the second rule, which is never use a long word where a short word will do, and also the fifth rule about scientific words and technical words. Quote, except for the useful abbreviations i.e., e.g., and etc., there is no real need for any of the hundreds of foreign phrases now current in English. Bad writers, and especially scientific, political, and sociological writers, are nearly always haunted by the notion that Latin or Greek words are grander than Saxon ones. And unnecessary words like expedite, ameliorate, predict, extraneous, deracinated, clandestine, subaqueous, and hundreds of others constantly gain ground from their Anglo-Saxon opposite numbers. It's The jargon peculiar to Marxist writing consists largely of words translated from Russian, German, or French, but the normal way of coining a new word is to use a Latin or Greek root with the appropriate affix and, where necessary, the eyes formation. It is often easier to make up words of this kind than to think up the English words that will cover one's meaning. So, it is common among the Orwell apologists to think of him as a sort of saint of secular liberal goodness. But in this passage, I think he sounds more like a Little Englander. He has this sort of brute dislike of foreign phrases, and he sounds more like the Nigel Farage of prose style than the Orwell of sanctified legend. This is insular protectionist nonsense to pretend that words like predict and impermissible pose any real threat to the use of language or political thought. His argument is similar to the way people object to having to buy foreign strawberries in the supermarket. Now, he claims that the decline of language must ultimately have political and economic causes, and that it creates a reinforcing loop in which a degraded political culture creates a degraded political language, and so on and so on and so on. And we must all surely be grateful for our rare good luck that 80 years later, having freely and deliberately used words like primary, promote, effective, and extramarital, we didn't in fact destroy democracy, as Orwell believes that we might have done. And really, these large claims about the nature of political language are cover for his very sort of small-minded lexical provincialism. And I would encourage you not to follow him in that. Especially because this dislike of Latin words led him to his most stupid rule, the injunction against technical, scientific, and jargon language. Now imagine if we had taken that seriously during the pandemic. Presumably The Economist and The New Scientist break that rule on every page every week, and good for them. And try writing honestly or seriously about government policy without jargon words like fiscal. It just wouldn't make any sense. And really, to debunk the idea that this sort of prose ensures honesty, we need only to look at one of Orwell's contemporaries, whose prose often preferred the Saxon word to the Latin, the short to the long, disliked jargon and was full of fresh imagery, and this was Winston Churchill, about whose manipulative and dishonest political writing whole books have been written. If you want further proof that it is possible to write short, simple English prose and still be a propagandist, pick up a tabloid newspaper. And what stands out most about this contradiction is that Orwell, who is supposedly devoted to fact and truth, was really a fiction writer. And this is what he said about making arguments with imaginative writing. Quote, "Imaginative writing is, as it were, a flank attack upon positions which are impregnable from the front. A writer attempting anything that is not coldly intellectual can do very little with words in their primary meanings. He gets his effect, if at all, by using words in a tricky, roundabout way." Now, tricky, roundabout writing is only permissible for fiction, but what is 1984 if it isn't political speech? That book is exemplary of Orwell's rules, but it was misused as British political propaganda after he died. Suddenly, the relationship between plain writing and political truth seems a little more complicated than Orwell's rules can admit. There is no style guide for honesty. The fact is that these rules are not rules, or if they are, it is only in the sense that we are taught rules at schools, like the idea that you cannot begin a sentence with "and" or any of that other sort of rubbish. And it belongs to the same class of silliness as collective nouns, like a murder of crows, a diligence of messengers, or a superfluity of nuns. That apparently is real. And what the rules and these collective nouns have in common is that they're really just for fun. Okay, people talk about them and they enjoy explicating them, but then they go about their business as if these things didn't really exist. No self-respecting person has ever referred to a murder of crows in any real way. It's just something you say at a dinner party or in the pub. And if someone pointed to a group of nuns and calls them a superfluity, you would probably make a mental note to avoid them in the future. Now, similarly, people talk about Orwell's rules, but then they go about their lives using words like predict and expedite without a second thought for whether the language is in decay and democracy is on the beam. Anyone who tries to tell you that by using the word clandestine you are corrupting the young, you would class with those people who think their television is sending out death rays. So why then are the rules so enduring? I think the first reason is that they are a sort of trade union manifesto for writers. Most professional writers enjoy what Martin Amis called the war against cliché, and Orwell gives them a very high-minded justification for their hobby. The contemporary reviewers of Orwell's essays were mostly novelists, and they all loved this opposition to cliché, much in the way that lawyers always are in favour of new regulations. And the rules are popular as well because they're so entertaining, like the collective nouns. The most perceptive review was by Orwell's friend Christopher Sykes, who happened to have worked as a diplomat, so that rare thing, a writer who's really actually used political writing. And he thought this essay was a mistake. He said it contained doubtful predictions and overstated views. Quote, "I will make one prophecy myself. George Orwell will be read for a long time, but for a reason which might not much have pleased him, namely that he is such splendid entertainment." And that's the truth, isn't it? Orwell's a lot of fun to read, but he's not actually correct. And really, when he's at his most entertaining, when he's most, writing his best, he breaks his own rules. And the critic Christopher Ricks demonstrates this very nicely in an essay called Clichés. This is a slightly long quote, but it's worth hearing because it really does string Orwell up. Quote, "Orwell's darkest urgings, in the words which end his essay, have a weirdly bright undertone." Here's the Orwell quote. "From time to time, one can, if one jeers loudly enough, send some worn-out and useless phrase, some jackboot, Achilles heel, hotbed, melting pot, acid test, veritable inferno, or some other lump of verbal refuse into the dustbin where it belongs." Here's Ricks again. "What is most alive in that sentence is not the sequence where Orwell consciously puts his polemical energy, his argumentative train of verbal clichés from worn-out to useless through lump of verbal refuse to the dustbin where it belongs, but rather the somber glints lurking in the sequence of the scorned clichés themselves. The way in which, even while he was saying they were useless phrases, Orwell used them so as to create a bizarre vitality of poetry. The jackboot has, hard on its heels, Achilles heel. Then the hotbed at once melts into the heat of melting pot, and then again a different melting into acid test, with perhaps some memory of Achilles held by the heel while he was dipped into the sticks. And then finally the veritable inferno, which not only consumes hotbed and melting pot, but also because of veritable confronts the truth-testing acid test. Orwell may have set his face against those clichés, but his mind, including his cooperative subconscious, was another matter." As Ricks notes, Orwell's expressed rules are at odds with his produced work. And this is the core of the debate. Orwell wants a rational system, but I think that's a mistake. Language is not fixed. It creates its own system while it adapts and changes to its environment. It evolves organically without the need of Orwell. Good writing is as good writing does. Language is Darwinian, not Newtonian. So one rule that you can usefully apply is that good writing meets its purpose, or meets the requirements of its medium, mode, or genre. Now you might think, well, this is a bit vague and this is a bit complicated, but that's the way it is. And to believe that simple rules like Orwell's are possible is to give in to the temptation of believing that there can be an answer to this question. But no such easy answer exists. To the truly liberal mind, you must be comfortable with a world that is largely self-organizing. And we discover good writing as it emerges organically. But to the socialist mind of George Orwell, a rational order is necessary. We must plan the production of steel and we must tell you what clichés you can use. Now, I am here to implore you to be liberal. Ignore the made-up rules. Don't let George Orwell tell you what you can write. In 1984, he warned against the government removing words from the dictionary because they were no longer politically convenient. But what do his rules do? They place strict limits on what you can and cannot say. This is miserable puritanism disguised as liberal intelligentsia. Don't give in to it. Orwell admitted that tricky roundabout writing was the most persuasive. His friend Christopher Sykes revealed him as being more entertaining than serious, and Christopher Ricks shows that no one writes better when breaking Orwell's rules than Orwell. Don't let the urge to find simple rules distract you from the truth of the matter. If you feel uncomfortable that this leaves us somewhat adrift, ignorant of what good writing really is, remember Samuel Johnson. To be ignorant is painful, but it is dangerous to quiet our uneasiness by the delusive opiate of hasty persuasion. My argument is simple. Do not give in to the delusive opiate of Orwell's hasty but very entertaining persuasion.
Bravo.
Yes.
Shall I stand? Yeah, why not? Okay. Now, I must apologise for referring to my notes more often than might be thought polite. This is not a TED talk. I haven't memorised it, and what I laughingly refer to as my memory is pretty rubbish in any case. So forgive me. Now, Henry is a fine speaker. I'm dazzled. He's also a fine writer, and that's how we met. And his newsletter, The Common Reader, is fantastic. And then when I found out that he was writing a book about how people could do great things in later life, obviously I had to meet him. So we contrived to meet, we contrived to argue. We found ourselves talking about prose style and Orwell's rules in particular, and we were enjoying our argument so much that we thought we'd carry it on in public and see if anybody else wanted to join us. So thank you for doing so. Now, Orwell's rules are still taught and respected widely in journalism, and I was surprised truly that Henry's views and mine differed so much. I thought we must be having a superficial agreement. I mean, look, I myself am often tempted to say that rules for writers are a bad thing. Writers are free birds. Writers must be free to say what they like, how they like. But deep down, I know that's not true. I mean, I know that all writers follow rules. They follow rules of spelling. They follow rules of syntax. They follow rules of grammar. I mean, you can defy even those rules if you want to. You can write Finnegan's Wake, but the price of that is that literally nobody understands you. Now, many writers and many journalists are fanatical about rules of punctuation in particular, split infinitives, Oxford commas. I sort of feel like those rules are the criminal code of the writing world, which you break at your peril, whereas questions of style are something more thinkable, something more like the jurisprudence of the writing world. I also note that the more people consider themselves to be writers, and I will spare you the air quotes, the more likely they are to think that good writing cannot be captured in rules. Okay, but somehow, having found myself in the position of defending Orwell's rules for writers, the more I've been thinking about them, the more I find myself agreeing with them. I am now a full-throated advocate of these rules, and the more I realise how much I myself have been practising those rules unthinkingly. And in fact, I suspect that most writers have their own rules. Most often those rules are pretty similar to Orwell's rules, and that accounts for the popularity and the durability of Orwell's rules. But writers are reluctant to admit that they follow rules, reluctant to admit that even to themselves, because they like to think that good writing is something transcendent, something magical, something that no rules can capture or constrain. And that is certainly true of the best writing. I also suspect that deep in the writing psyche, we find the ancient enmity between writers and editors. So the writer looks at Orwell's rules and imagines Orwell as some great editor in the sky with a blue pencil poised to strike out all of the long words in Shakespeare and Milton. So, just to be clear, Orwell called these rules for writers and not rules for editors. If you are a writer and I'm an editor and you use a long word, then I am not entitled to delete the long word and insert a short word, at least not without asking you. Strict rules for editors do exist, but they are almost entirely about consistency, where to put hyphens, what words to capitalize, stuff like that. You get style books. The Economist's style book is probably the best known. A style book does standardize the writing voice to some degree, but I'm afraid that's something you just accept and even desire if you find yourself in the happy position of writing for The Economist or reading The Economist. I mean, if you don't like The Economist's style or anybody else's style, then probably you should consider writing or reading something else. Okay, which brings us to the question, who are these writers for whom these rules for writers are intended? Now, it would be tempting here to make a distinction between journalism and literature, as Orwell does himself. So we might say Orwell's rules are good for journalists and speechwriters and technical writers, but not for writers of literature. We might even try to define literature as writing by people who don't follow any rules. But I don't think that holds up. I can't see that a set of rules might be useful for getting ideas across in journalism, but not useful for getting ideas across in literature. So I think I have to make the case for Orwell's rules being good also for literary writers, for authors. I mean, if we want to say that Orwell's rules are more relevant to journalists and less relevant to authors, I can live with that. But I do think that they are relevant and recommendable to authors too. Now, I want to bore you by actually referring to the rules. So we've all got sheets, right, with these things on. Okay, so I fear Henry, for all his brilliance, may have slightly been a bit fuzzy on some of the logic. Never use a metaphor, simile, or other figure of speech which you are used to seeing in print. Now, this is a terrible rule. Our entire language consists of figures of speech which we are used to seeing in print. Now, what Orwell means is don't write in cliches. Now, I don't know why he didn't say that. Perhaps he felt a need to explain what cliches were. Or perhaps you're there before me. Perhaps he got tangled up in his own rule. Let me say against foreignness, because I will come to that, which we will come to shortly. Okay, so let's forget that one for the moment, shall we? Never use a long word where a short one will do. This is an excellent rule. And please note what it says. It says, never use a long word where a short one will do. It does not say, never use a long word. So it's up to you, the writer, to decide whether the short word will do what you want it to do. So, often you can just say, bad. There may be times when you really need to say egregious, or substandard, or lamentable. But if you can just say bad, then in my view, say bad. Next, if it is possible to cut a word out, always cut it out. My first reaction to this rule is to cut out the word always. Then I'm going to cut out both of the outs. Then I'm going to collapse the impersonal construction. And what we are left with is, if you can cut a word, cut it. That's 8 words in place of Orwell's 13. But even in Orwell's original form, this is still an excellent rule. Okay? There will be situations in which you can cut a word with no loss of meaning. I contend I have done that in deleting the word always. There will be times when cutting a word changes the meaning entirely. There is a world of difference between good and not good. Then there will be situations in which you fear that cutting a word might result in some loss of nuance. And the problems are always in that middle zone where you've used a word in the hope of capturing a nuance, and the chances are that word is an adverb or an intensifier. So here it is in real life. She smiled. Okay, that's fine, people smile. She smiled happily. Your call. I mean, perhaps it's good to be on the safe side and point out that the smile is a sign of happiness. She smiled very happily. Okay, at that point, I honestly suggest that you consider a different verb or find some other way of making the point. She smiled sadly. Okay, bravo. You know, there is an adverb doing some useful work. It's paying its way. You wouldn't cut it. Okay, by the by, he sat down awkwardly. I'm always reading about people sitting down awkwardly, but I've never seen it happen in real life. Because nobody is sat down awkwardly. I do sometimes just see people sit down and then shuffle about a bit. Okay, but that's by the by. Okay, another reason to cut words is that brevity and clarity usually go together. We can get philosophical, and David can help us if I get a bit out of my depth here, but we can get a bit philosophical about whether brevity and clarity necessarily go together, and why brevity and clarity should even be considered good things in the first place. My basic view here is that we live in conditions of uncertainty. There are a lot of things that we don't know, so brevity and clarity are useful conventions for communicating the information that we do know in easily digested forms. Okay? But for brevity alone, which is the subject of this rule, the argument is much simpler. If you can say something in a few words, then say it. And additional words cannot possibly be useful because you have already said what you wanted to say. Next one. Never use the passive where you can use the active. This is the rule that gets grammarians a bit excited. You know, the wording is a bit aggressive, you know, the injunction is a bit forbidding. If Orwell had said, use the active voice when you can, that would have gone down more easily, though it would still have left us with the question of what is the active voice? It's often quite difficult to tell the active voice and the passive voice apart. So, you know, we get confused about the extent of the rule. If I say with delight, the room is crowded. Is crowded? That feels a bit passive-y. I mean, poor room getting crowded like this all the time. But if I say the room is empty, then we can see right away that crowded and empty are adjectives. The rule doesn't apply. Now, John was hurt. Is that the passive voice? Well, if John was walking around in a general state of hurtfulness and having been hurt, then no. I mean, John was hurt in much the same way that Jill is happy and James is tall. But if, when I say John was hurt, the real story is that I hurt John, or John was hurt by me, then John was hurt is passive, and I've used the passive to obscure my own part in John's tragedy. And this gets us to the point of Orwell's rule, I think. It isn't really about the niceties of grammar. It's about information. the passive voice implies that the important part of a given action is the person or thing on the receiving end of it. And sometimes this is indeed the case. President Kennedy assassinated. Now that is a perfect passive headline. Unknown person assassinates President Kennedy is a terrible headline, even though it's written in the active voice. And even if we know who it is, Lee Harvey Oswald assassinates President Kennedy isn't much better. If we want an example of the passive voice that we're going to put in a museum of grammar for future generations to admire, then we might choose the phrase, mistakes were made. Okay? Now, if we said instead, President Bush made mistakes, we would have a lot more relevant, useful information. If I was writing a newspaper article, I might possibly say, mistakes were made by President Bush and by other people in his administration. Or I might say, mistakes were made by President Bush, but they weren't nearly as bad as the media claimed. Now, those are both well-formed sentences in which we want to enlarge upon the mistakes without obscuring their authorship. The only occasion on which I must use the passive voice is if I want to admit that mistakes were made without mentioning President Bush at all. If I were President Bush, for example, that might be my choice, but that would be a matter of strategy rather than prose style. So, in general, the active voice gives you the clearest picture of events, and my feeling is if you want to use the passive voice, you should probably have a reason for doing so. You should want to put what has been done, or the person that it's been done to, at the focus of the sentence, and you should want to move the person who did the thing to the margins of the sentence. And that's fine, you can do that, and you're in perfect conformity with Orwell's very sensible rule. Now, here's the one we're waiting for. Never use a foreign phrase, a scientific word, or a jargon word, if you can think of an everyday English equivalent. So, yes, it sounds Brexity, doesn't it? And no getting over it. Those finicky foreign phrases with all their vinaigrettes and fancy sauces versus the roast beef of everyday English. Now, Orwell was culturally very conservative, but let that not dissuade us from understanding what he's actually saying here and then agreeing with it. So first, note that Orwell says foreign phrase, not foreign word. I mean, he goes on to say foreign word, so obviously he is alert to the distinction between words and phrases. And that matters because at the level of words, there is no defensive moat to protect our English homemade words from foreign intruders. First, because English is an international language. Your lift is my elevator. Second, because all English words come from somewhere. All of our root words come from Sanskrit or Latin or Old Norse or in the future from ChatGPT or whatever. But you know, they come. Now there are millions and millions of foreign words which are not English. If you want some, the Chinese language is full of them. But there are no English words which are not in some way foreign. Now, as for foreign phrases, let's say, for the sake of argument, that a foreign phrase is a phrase that we would expect to see in italics. Esprit d'escalier, for example. Noblesse oblige. Mutatis mutandis. Ad infinitum. Reductio ad absurdum. Or even Weltschmerz. Though with German we're going to have to blur that distinction between words and phrases. Now, sometimes we have everyday English equivalents and sometimes we don't. I mean, if I say forever, probably that will do instead of ad infinitum. The trade-off there is between showing off and wanting to be understood. And it's probably better to want to be understood. Now, it's also worth noting that foreign phrases used in everyday English are almost always cliches, especially. They are almost always used ironically to some extent. I mean, when did you last hear somebody say noblesse oblige and mean it? They are very frequently misunderstood and misspelled, and there is very rarely agreement on how they should be pronounced. So if, as a writer, you use them, then in my view, you're taking on a whole lot of risks that you don't need to take. Okay, so that's the foreign ones. Now, next, the scientific words. It depends, I suppose, who you are writing for, and or will have the general reader in mind. So if you're a novelist writing, hoping to find readers, let us say, then you're going to say heart attack. If you're a doctor writing a clinical note for another doctor, I guess you say myocardial infarction, if that is indeed a more exact term which is likely to communicate more concrete information to your intended reader, the other doctor. But let's not be silly about this. There's a lot of science in the world, I concede that freely. We often have to talk about it. Yeah, that's true. And it's hard to talk about science without using scientific words. Yes, full marks. But Orwell's rule is limited to cases in which you choose to use a scientific word even when you have an everyday English equivalent on hand. So, if you don't know the term heart attack, but you do know the term myocardial infarction, let's say you're a visiting cardiologist with very little English, then you're going to have to say myocardial infarction even when making the smallest of small talk. But if you do know the term heart attack, then, oops, I'm making everything flash. Okay, but if you do know the term heart attack, then you'll do well to use it in ordinary speech, because you're more likely then to be understood by more people. Now, on to the worst or the second worst. I think probably the second worst of these rules. Break any of these rules sooner than say anything outright barbarous. I've had to say that quite slowly because the grammar is all strange to me. I would say break any of these rules rather than saying anything outright barbarous. But maybe that's the prose of the 1940s. But anyway, it's a stupid rule. It's a standard get-out clause, which something like it gets attached to all rules for writers, and actually all terms and conditions of any kind. It's meant to make you feel better about following the rules by telling you that you have free will. You don't have to follow them if you don't want to. And of course that's the case. I mean, these rules are not contractually binding. Okay, but a question is begged here, to put it mildly. If you can distinguish confidently between bad writing and good writing, then probably you don't have all that much need for Orwell's rules in the first place. Also, I find the wording of that particular rule patronising and offensive, rather as though we are all liable to veer into barbarism if we are stupid enough to take Orwell's rules too literally. And I also find the instruction illogical in that if I want to say something barbarous, then Orwell's rules will be just as helpful to me as when I want to say something non-barbarous. So I would simply modestly propose rephrasing that last rule to express more clearly the limitations of the rules themselves. So follow these rules only to the extent that you want or need such rules to follow. Now I do. I mean, I've been writing for a living for more than 40 years. I thought I had outgrown other people's rules, but actually I'd just forgotten them. Going back to Orwell's rules, I see lots of good points that I had forgotten or misunderstood. And I've tried, I hope, to bring out those points in talking here this evening. So I'm very grateful to Henry and Sarah and Phyllis and Katell and Jackson and City Lit for giving me cause to look again at what I thought I knew, and I'm especially grateful to you all for listening so patiently, and I would be very grateful for any comments and criticisms, especially criticisms that you might have. Thank you.
So we have about 15 minutes left to invite questions from the audience, but I just had a few questions to start with, if that's okay. And I don't know if we really explained it at the beginning. So Robert and Henry came together because they both responded to an article written by David Bentley Hart, is that correct?
That's the one.
And who was writing very much against Orwell's rules. And so some of the things I wanted to ask you about refer back to your original blogs that you wrote, if that's okay. I've got them here if you need to. But
I stand by everywhere.
Henry. So I love the first line of your essay. I hate in italics, by the way, Orwell's writing rules. And you mentioned the nasty trend that Orwell helped to embed in ordinary English, which you say is still with us today.
Yes.
And that really stopped me, and I thought, gosh, are we all kind of poisoned by this? And do you really think it's pervasive as all that even people who have never even seen the 6 rules are following those rules?
Yeah, I think
Yeah.
all of the writing advice online says cut words, be short, use Saxon phrases. It's this kind of reductive approach, and this is very, very standard advice. And it just leads, like, everything sounds like a shampoo. And this is why most writing online isn't very clever, because they don't have the scope of language they need to say interesting things.
But so I'm wondering, Robert, because one of the things that you mentioned just now, I'm feeling a chicken and egg thing. Are those the rules because because that's what works, or is that what we think works because Orwell laid that out in 1946? I don't know.
I think we're comfortable with it.
Yeah.
We could embark on greater length on why brevity is a good thing and why clarity is a good thing. And I think that until such time as you have found that ideal to which you want to dedicate the rest of your life, like reading Shakespeare or listening to Beethoven, then you're constantly experimenting and sampling and looking for the next best thing. So I think that's one reason why I want most stuff to be short and I want most stuff to be clear, so that I can find my way around quickly. I can digest a lot of stuff and I can think, yeah, that is the complicated, difficult book that I want to read. Or maybe a simple book, but I think that if we do agree that brevity and clarity are good things in writing and speech, then Orwell's rules are a very effective set of rules for achieving that end. I mean, they're certainly a lot better than any others I have seen, in the sense that Orwell does it in 6 sentences, where Strunk and White do it in 90 pages, and it's pretty much the same story. So I think if you know somebody who is really in favour of all of the writing going on in the world being hard to understand and full of digressions, then they need a different set of rules. But for people who want stuff to be reasonably clear and reasonably economical, then Orwell's rules are a good fit. I think we've all got them inside us, and that's why we like the rules. And obviously, as Henry says, there's some
feedback loop there that we've got the rules inside us, we produce that sort of writing, we see that sort of writing, we internalise the rules. But we had Newton reinvented physics, Einstein reinvented physics. I mean, somebody can reinvent prose if this paradigm really is just too full of anomalies.
But to reinvent, I think you have to be familiar as well. There's a fluency that you should have, or at least an acknowledgement of things that work and things that don't work before you start messing around with it and messing around with intent to get an effect that you want.
Yes, I think of Orwell's rules definitely as a floor rather than a ceiling. They are things that you should know if only you are going to react against them later on. And if you are a genius, you will react against them, and you should react against them, and you should go ahead and be a genius. Otherwise, they're useful things to have slotted in. And as and when somebody else writes a better textbook, you can read that one instead.
I wonder if we just get rid of the word rules and think of it as nudges and get rid of the always and the all and the never, and it becomes more, I don't know, Henry, would you be almost more open to,
But then why do you need them?
yeah,
At that point, he's just saying be precise. You should really just get rid of all of these rules and say what you mean. And then you're left with the very difficult question of, oh my God, what do I mean? You mean it's not as easy as just cutting words and making everything shorter? I need to know what I mean. That's the problem with the rules.
I think you're more likely to know what you mean if you express it in a few simple words than if you express it in a Baroque essay.
I'm not asking for Baroque, I just think
really?
people
Stand your ground.
I think people should be free to choose whichever style works for what they're trying to say, and Orwell's rules are not taught as a flaw, they're taught as the correct way to do English, in the way that we're told you can't split an infinitive or whatever, but you can and you should, and it works sometimes.
That is subject to investigation. I mean, that's a claim which I think is not strictly true, but let it stand. I would have thought that you could operate equally well at a slightly woollier level just by saying, if you teach these rules even just as good advice, you are liable to intimidate or subconsciously constrain the brilliant writer who may be less inclined in later life to cut away with multisyllabic words. Yeah, I mean, I think that's a worry. If you teach somebody the basics, then there is a danger that they may stick by the basics. There is a trade-off there. Supposing we had no Shakespeare, but all literature was significantly better because people followed strict rules. I don't know. I mean, football. I mean, what if there was no Lionel Messi, but everybody played better football? That would be an okay trade-off. So I think if you think that Orwell's rules are depriving us of geniuses by intimidating them in their cradle, then I would say, yeah, that's a serious problem. But if you want to deny useful rules to people who can make good use of them, just in case one of them turns out to be Shakespeare, then I don't think that's a positive thing.
I think the rules are taught as if they're the only rules. And this means that even the average writer, or the sub-average writer, or the person writing an email to their mother is deprived of the uses of other ways of using English, which are perfectly good. It's just that George Orwell didn't like them because they were foreign and not socialistic.
You see what we mean about an argument? I mean, we were sitting there in the cafe in the Royal Academy, and we were actually arguing. Two nice people. We otherwise get on perfectly well. So I mean, don't let us just argue amongst ourselves. Tell us if you think we are being foolish or ignorant or talking at cross purposes or whatever. No?
Any questions?
Yeah.
Yeah, we've got, hi.
Hi, you mentioned physics earlier. When physicists talk about the laws of the universe, we don't really know what they mean. They're these sort of patterns. So it's the same with the rules for me. What is their purpose? Brevity, I mean, yeah, great, that seems to me a matter of individual taste, but is this just something constructed by somebody in a certain cultural context? He was reacting to the rise of totalitarianism, what that does to everyday language and that kind of thing. and rather than some sort of platonic, overarching, universal rules for all time, always.
Yeah, it's a pity in a way that Orwell wrote 1984, even though that is his second best book, because he sort of inclines you to make the connection between these rules, which are perfectly good, and the idea of newspeak, which is horrible. So, I'm not defending newspeak. If there was a slippery slope from Orwell's rules to newspeak, then that's too big a price to pay. I don't want the rules. But I don't think there is that slope for all sorts of reasons. I mean, even within the novel, newspeak doesn't really exist. I mean, it's just an idea, a hypothesis, an appendix. I don't believe that if you don't have a word, then you don't have an idea and you don't do the thing. I mean, if we don't have a word for war, I think we would still have wars, for example. I think the reason we have a word for war is because we do wars and we need to talk about them. So I don't...
But you do think that it's important to distinguish between different forms of badness, because you said that in your remarks. And if we got rid of the word egregious, we would be equating different forms of badness, like I took a cookie I wasn't supposed to take, with I did something truly egregious. And that would be a fault, a moral fault in language, which Orwell is encouraging you into believing.
Possibly. I mean, I was encouraging you to read the words to the letter, because it seems to me that and I didn't actually know what egregious meant, so I had to go and look it up. I mean, I thought egregious meant like just sort of, out on a limb, an outlier. It was only when I looked it up that I found it actually that it was, it meant an outlier in a bad way. So no, I mean, the position I'm defending is there may be times when you need to say egregious, and if so, then say egregious. But I mean, don't just say egregious because you think bad is a...
But what Orwell's rules have encouraged people to do is say, oh, egregious is one of those long words, I don't know what it means. Let's say bad, everybody knows bad, even though you might genuinely be talking about something horrific or egregious or whatever. And I think this point is true. These are not platonic rules. Most people in most places in most times haven't written according to these rules, and they've written very well and been understood and done interesting things. We have.
I just want to take issue with you, Henry. Just
Good.
getting my courage up.
You want to tell me to nationalise steel and obliterate words?
No, it's just you illustrated, I think, what Orwell was trying to say, where he's saying use fewer words, because you said truly egregious. So you modified egregious. Wouldn't it have been better or more accurate just to choose an even more egregious word and not have egregious? So like, say appalling. Isn't that what he's trying to say? Is that be accurate. Think about what words you're going to use in this context. And rather to rush to one off the shelf or take one you particularly like egregious and modify it, get the exact one you need.
Why didn't he say that? He
I
had a
think he
lot of
did.
room in that essay, and he never said those words. He's also supposed to be one of the best writers of the 20th century, and he didn't get round to being that clear and concise. And I think also this is just a form of pedantry. You pretty much know what I meant when I said truly egregious, and you can see that it is significantly different from bad. And beyond this, we're getting into a form of pedantry that's sort of Thomas Aquinas level of hair splitting in order to defend some rules by a socialist who likes beef and murder. Who cares? Let me say what I want to say, and you pretty much know what I mean. That's fine.
I'm kind of, I feel like a case study here.
Well, I'm glad I've united you now.
I didn't know what egregious meant, so I didn't really have it as a useful word. And then I went and looked it up, and I'm not sure it's, I'm not now looking around for egregious things that I can call egregious. But I want to defend Henry here because
Even Robert's voting for me.
I mean, it doesn't really matter whether Orwell follows Orwell's rules. I mean, he could write a load of rubbish and his rules could still be valid. The world of philosophy is full of philosophers who behave as though reality exists, or they're going to die, or they do things wrong despite they don't spend all their time jumping into ponds or giving their money away. But that doesn't stop their philosophy being good philosophy. The world of economics is full of people who couldn't save up for a summer holiday to save their lives. But that doesn't seemingly undermine the validity of their economics. So I would say lay off the rest of Orwell and consider the just consider the rules. Now,
We've got one more question, if that's, is that all right?
Yeah.
Okay.
If you had to choose in general, would you think it would be better for more people to understand you or few people to understand you extremely well?
Ooh.
Good question.
No, more people, but I don't think that's what Orwell. I think Orwell is unfairly given the credit for saying that's what he's trying to do.
The 1,000 true fans.
But
Yes.
isn't it more democratic to use words that more people recognize?
Depends how stupid you think people are.
Depends if you're in a democracy too, I
But some
suppose.
people are stupid.
Well, I'm always willing to make myself the example of whatever the fault is. Are we going to have a vote or not? Do we
Yeah,
disagree?
I think we should.
Or do we actually secretly agree? No, we don't agree, do we?
No.
we
No.
don't agree.
I don't think that you
Just
found
giving-
any
just giving
common
you the
ground.
chance.
No, I
Okay.
think we got further apart.
So what's our motion? Orwell's
So-
rules are bad for writers. So if
Well,
you...
I think it's easier if we vote for the faces. So,
Okay.
who's voting for Robert? Oh boy.
Oh no.
Well, let's see Henry's votes. We need to see Henry's votes.
Oh yes.
Yeah.
Who voted twice?
These are the smart.
If you didn't say people couldn't vote twice, to be fair.
I didn't.
Right, now, we've got a few bottles of Sainsbury's wine and some paper cups, so I don't want to oversell this, but if you'd like to come and argue a bit more bilaterally, then we're
So
going to
just
be
like to
in
say
the canteen.
thank you to Robert and to Henry. Apologies for the screen. I think I first
Will the room stay unlocked? Will the room stay unlocked?
Did you?
Yeah, but that was much more interesting, I think.
Font that is kind of breaking.
See you next week. We'll talk about it next week.